Greetings, everyone. I hope everybody's doing well. And here we are with the second episode of my show now. Pleasure to have you all here with me. And if you're watching on YouTube, switch over to my channel. We're trying to grow the channels and expand the DD Geopolitics family. So come on over if you're not subscribed already and things like that. It's great to have you all here. Really happy that we can have another episode. And my style is a bit different, as many of you know. I like it to be more like a classroom, more academic, so to speak, more in depth. So the professor is in, as people are saying, and I'm happy to have you all here. I'm happy to have you all here with me. So we have a lot to get through. There's a lot of things I'd like to cover, a lot of material. Also, these streams will provide an opportunity to read through articles that you might not have time to do yourself. So we kind of do it together. And I think that is much better. I always like the collective model of education, and always together we can learn from one another and really expand our reach and our understanding of so many things. So great to have all of you here today so far. So let's get started. And of course, we're going to start with the school that was targeted. Now we know by the U.S., but we're going to go through it a little bit, and I'm going to show you how you can do some of this research on your own and how you can unpack some of this information. Make sure you, before we get started, make sure you like, comment, subscribe, share, get this far and wide to all the different communities that we have here, and we want to make sure that people have an opportunity to get good information and continue to learn. And that's really the main element here, is to build a community that is open-minded, that is critically thinking, and that can really do some change in this world. Otherwise, what's the point of it all? So let's get started here. We'll play the first video, and then we'll get into the discussion.
Ooh.
So to start off tonight's show, we're going to be talking about what it was that hit that girls' school. And according to reports that we have, it was at this point stated to be a double tap. That is, that the first missile or projectile hit the school. And then after a period of time, when people on the ground responded to the attack and responded to the dead and the wounded, including medical personnel on scene, another strike also hit. This is, of course, illegal under international law and under the various conventions that exist, including within the rules of many nations' books on armed conflict. But, of course, it is carried out most notably by the Zionist entity and by the United States. Let's take a look more closely at this. So you can see there generally the shape of the missile, the projectile, the bomb, whatever it is at first that we can see. So now we look at that shape and say, okay, it doesn't look like a JDAM. It doesn't look like a 1,000 or 2,000 pound bomb. It definitely has a much more slender look. It looks like it has a set of fins. You can see there clearly that there is in the mid part of that object a set of protruding metal arms, basically. And then on the back, we see also what looks to be a part of the propulsion system and the fins around that. So now we're gonna take a look. Okay, so we have that as an image, right? We have that as an image. Now let's take a look at what other things we have that might reveal some aspects of what we're looking at. So if we look here, this is the Tomahawk cruise missile, right? And so let me just take a look here. Let me add this to our conversation here. So I'm going to remove this. All right. So all of you saw that. Let me bring this up a little bit more so you can see. So you see here the Tomahawk cruise missile. Now, we already know that tomahawks were used in the initial opening of these strikes on Iran as part of this preemptive war, this illegal war that has gone on now for 9 days. You see there, the object looks, in the image that we saw, looks very, very, very similar, near identical to this. And now this is just the object in its flight mode or in its launching mode. And we'll take a closer look here. Let me just zoom in here for you all. So for example, if we look at this a bit closer, right, you can see here, for example, you see the fins here, and you see the back fins near the propulsion system. So clearly it has some overlap. There's no doubt about that. Now let's take a look at the object here, the Tomahawk cruise missile, as it's impacting a target. That I think will be very interesting for us. So let's take a look at that. Let me just switch the screen here. And now we will take a look at what it looks like when it hits a target. Oh, that looks, if you look here, that looks very close to the silhouette that we saw, right? Take a look at that. Take a look at that. And then if we can then take a look back at the original image, clearly, actually, let me just zoom in here. Here, let me come back to this image because this is going to be closer. And I like doing this because I think it's very important for us to do investigative work. This is part of our job. I mean, especially if we are really committed to this. So you look at that right there. I want you all to take a look at that. That is near identical to what we saw in that video. Let me actually put it up again. Let's put it up. Somebody's asking if I can see the questions. I can sometimes, but I'm not always looking at the chat because I'm busy going through different things. If somebody can collect them all, and then we can sort of jot them down, that would be great, just to help me out, because I'm a one-man operation now. So let's look at this again. Wow. Now that's at a further distance. I mean, we have a close-up. Take a look at that. All right. That is, for me, near visual confirmation. I mean, that is, and we can even go back and watch the video again. Ooh. So that to me is a visual confirmation that this was indeed a Tomahawk cruise missile that was used against this girls' school. And I'm not sure if this was deliberate targeting on the by the commanders. I'm not sure if this was AI and some bullshit system that they're employing, much like the Zionists do in Gaza. But in any case, regardless of whether it was AI or a person or a group of people or commanders or the president, everyone bears responsibility for this barbarism. This is a war crime. This is a war crime, and it needs to be accounted for. You don't double tap by just happenstance, by accident. This was a selected target. And whether it was an AI system, it needed to be double checked by a human. And I guarantee you that they selected this target on purpose. I believe that. Because you don't just, because they've targeted now not only schools, and they've hit a boys' school as well, they've targeted hospitals and civilian infrastructure, which we will get to. So I just want everyone to know. And yes, as somebody in the comment says, that was the second strike, because we saw the first one. There was already a plume of smoke nearby. So that was the double tap that we're seeing there. All right. So we've got that. And I want to now get into some of the narrative that's been floating about, and particularly a really awful thing that I read today that I want us to take a look at together. So let's look at this. CPAC head says Iranian schoolgirls are better dead than in a burqa. I mean, you can't make this shit up. I'm sorry to say. You can't make this shit up. Iranian schoolgirls are better dead than in a burqa. First of all, I'm sure many of our viewers will know, Iranians don't wear burqas. Burqas are in Afghanistan, and particularly they are within the Taliban orbit. So they have burqas. Iranians traditionally wear the chador, where you can see your whole face, right? So it covers the face. But most Iranians now wear also a hijab, and they show some part of their hair. Now you don't even have to wear it. We've seen so many women on the street that aren't wearing it. But Iranians do not wear the chador. Iranians do wear the chador historically and culturally. They do not wear the burqa. The burqa is not traditional to Iranian society. Now, it might have been historically at some point, but it has not been for centuries. And really, the burqa is something very unique to the Afghan world, and by extension to parts of Pakistan. And the niqab, which is the one where you can see only the eyes, that's something that is from the Arabian Peninsula. That's also something that you don't necessarily find very often, and that's mostly in Arab culture. So this is really, really horrific. Let's listen to what he had to say on Piers Morgan, because I thought that it was pretty horrific. So let's take a listen here.
To wait, and now it turns out it was friendly fire from a Kuwaiti pilot who mistook them for Iranians. So I just think we need to get to facts before you.
I know, Piers. I understand
this
what
was
you're
definitely
saying.
An Israeli missile.
Piers, even if it was an Iranian missile that was fired in response to the attack from Israel and the United States, right? Even if it was an Iranian missile, those girls would still be alive today if the United States and Israel had not launched the attack. So you are right. We don't know who launched the missile, but we know that if the US and Israel had not attacked a country that poses no serious threat to them, Israel has hundreds of nuclear weapons, America has thousands, that those girls would be alive.
Okay, but I would also say to that it is indisputable that it is indisputable to me. Well, hang on, Matt, please. Hang on, please. Let me finish my point. Matt, let me just make the point. You're probably going to make the same point.
It literally says they're going to be in a they were going to be in a burqa. They're going to be in a burqa, and this is a barbaric society. I mean, you can't make this shit up. I'm sorry, you can't make this shit up. This is horrible. This is the level of discourse now amongst so-called public figures, these political figures in the United States. I mean, what's happening here? They're saying it openly. We've always known. I mean, if you're a historian, if you enjoy, reading about American history, you know how they treated indigenous people. You know how they treated black people. You know how they treated the Irish when they came, the Italians, different Catholic groups, the Orthodox when they came. There's a lot of these instances. By the way, a lot of people don't even know the Ku Klux Klan in New England, for example, targeted Catholics. So in Vermont, the only major Ku Klux Klan attack was the burning down of a Catholic church. In the South, the Ku Klux Klan targeted not only blacks and Jews, but also Orthodox Christians, including the Greek community. I've met some older Greeks who grew up under a horrific situation of KKK violence. So it goes to show you that the United States has always had a dark side amongst its political elite, especially amongst this elite that I think are connected at the deeper level with all these different groups and societies and fraternities and this kind of stuff that really, kinds of builds this next generation of people who are ideologically committed to the same things they are. And they use humiliation and rituals and hazing for all of that. But I think that it's important to understand that the U.S. now is full masks off under the Trump administration. There's no doubt about it. They're openly saying they want the death of Iranians. They don't mind about the civilian casualties and things like that. So that's really important to recognize here. And I want us to now make sure that we understand that this was, in fact, the atrocity was, in fact, committed by the United States. Tomahawk cruise missiles were used, and we have video evidence and forensic evidence now that we can see that points to that. So I want to pivot now. So we've talked about that. And I want to now pivot to discussing the next topic for us, which is the transformation now of the military doctrine. So for those of you who have an understanding, there has been a transformation over time over which kind of military doctrine rules. We know we had Bush doctrine, Powell doctrine. We've had various doctrines throughout times, the Clinton doctrine. Now we are beginning to see not only the Donroe doctrine, but a much larger Trump doctrine, a Trump doctrine of a way of doing things. Also, I want us to get into that, and I want us to really understand and unpack that. That's really important for us. Of course, we have the Epstein doctrine, everyone knows, and the Bibi doctrine, the Satan doctrine, as many are saying in the chat. True enough. Let's take a look. First and foremost, I want us to go back in time because history is important. And do we remember this person? Anyone in the chat know who this is? I'm interested. How many remember this person? I remember them. I was young, but I remember them. And I remember later on what they ended up doing. Anyone in the chat want to throw out? There we go. Colin Powell. So this is Colin Powell when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he was really the major architect of what became then the Powell Doctrine. And the Powell Doctrine is built upon a previous level of military knowledge and understanding about conducting war. And what I'd like to do now is we're going to get into some articles that have come out recently and to kind of take a look at it. But before we do, let's look at what the Powell Doctrine spoke about in terms of armed conflict, and now what the transformations are in American foreign policy and American military doctrine that are happening right now. So let's take a look. Let's go to, so this is from the Atlantic Council, which is basically a NATO think tank for all intents and purposes. So this is from 2021. The Powell Doctrine's wisdom must live on. So that's when Colin Powell died. So let's take a look at the Powell Doctrine. So in here, the author writes, in its simplest formulation, the Powell Doctrine is a set of criteria governing the use of force abroad. Eurasia Group President Ian Bremmer, in his book Superpower, 3 Choices for America's Role in the World, summarized the doctrine as 8 key questions. Number 1, is a vital national security interest threatened? Number 2, do we have a clear and attainable objective? Number 3, have the risks and costs been fully and frankly analyzed? Number 4, have all other nonviolent policy means been fully exhausted? Number 5, is there a plausible exit strategy to avoid endless entanglement? Number 6, have the consequences of U.S. action been fully considered? Number 7, is the action supported by the American people? And number 8, do we have genuine, broad international support? I think that many now would look at this and say, I think we're missing a lot of those in this case. So as many of you are noting in the chat, we have a lot of holes in this. So the Powell Doctrine would not agree with the strategy of the Trump administration now. They would have done it a different way. I'm not saying that they wouldn't have attacked under the Powell Doctrine, but they would have done it a different way. You have, for example, number 7, is the action supported by the American people? Clearly not. The overwhelming majority of Americans, at least in a majority, do not agree with what is happening. Is it a vital national security? Is a vital national security interest threatened? If you're thinking about Israel as a national security interest, then yes. But no, not for the United States. There was no U.S. national security interest that was threatened. Number two, do we have a clear and attainable objective? Clearly not. We have no objective that has been laid out. There's been nothing that has been clearly laid out for us to understand what the objective is. First, it was Iranian ballistic missiles, the Iranian nuclear program, but they said they already destroyed the nuclear program in the 12-day war last year. So what actually is the objective? First, it was the nuclear, then it was the ballistic missiles, then it was the proxies. Now it's full-on regime change. They've killed the supreme leader. We just elected the next supreme leader, which is Ayatollah Khamenei's son, Mojtaba Khamenei. So that, and he's even a little bit more conservative and more, according to the Western press, radical. So they didn't change much of anything. And I think that there is still no clear objective. Do they want a government to remain that's clerical, not Islamic Republic, full regime change, balkanization? Nobody knows what's going on. The third one, have the risks and costs been fully and frankly analyzed? Clearly not, because as I mentioned last night, the national security report that was prepared by these security experts, these intelligence experts, clearly said that there was no way forward for regime change, and that regime change would be extremely costly. So clearly, number three, they didn't expect that it would go this way and that the Strait of Hormuz would be closed and there'd be attacks on oil infrastructure. And we're seeing closure of Dubai airport and tourism and travel. I mean, we have a lot. We have a lot that has not fully been flushed out. Have all other nonviolent policy means been fully exhausted? Clearly not. They attacked in the middle of negotiations. There was supposed to be a technical group a week after, and they attacked in the middle of negotiations. Is there plausible exit strategy to avoid endless entanglement? Clearly not. This is about to turn into an endless entanglement. Unless the U.S. goes with its tail between its leg and fully retreats, clearly we are in an endless war scenario now. And that's a major, major problem for everyone. Have the consequences of U.S. action been fully considered? I don't think so, because they've opened Pandora's box. And now how to put all of that back in is not possible now. They've completely changed the Middle East, whether they wanted to or not, in their own myopic vision. They have changed it, and they've unleashed forces that now they cannot control. Is the action supported? Like we said, no. And do we have genuine broad international support? Clearly not. Everybody in the international community is mostly against what's happening. So I just want people to understand that we are in a situation where we really don't have a clear understanding, a clear plan forward, and a general idea of how this is in any way in the interest of the American people, America first. This is clearly Israel first. And of course, the chaos in the region helps Israel because it wants its own project, Greater Israel, Third Temple, its own messianic designs, and some of the Christian Zionists want that as well. They're all waiting for the Messiah or Armageddon or a combination of the two. Let's go now, and I want to show you how this is shaping up. Let's go now to look at what is happening in the foreign policy establishment. So we have this article coming out, Trump's Way of War. And this is why already people are declaring the end of the Powell Doctrine. So this is from Richard Fontaine, who's the CEO of the Center for New American Security. He worked in the Department of State, National Security Council, and was foreign policy advisor to U.S. Senator John McCain. So you know that he comes from like an older, mainstream, mainline foreign policy establishment, but neocon establishment. But in any case, Trump's way of doing war is not their way of doing war, and they might be happy. But clearly, some of them are not happy because it's not going the way that they wanted it to go. Now, foreign affairs is considered to be the mouthpiece, so to speak, of a lot of the foreign policy establishment. If you don't read it, I would suggest that you do read it, not because you agree with it, but because you understand the mentality. That's why I subscribe to it and I read it, because I'm able to look at what do the foreign policy experts, analysts, and career diplomats think about foreign policy and foreign affairs. How are they thinking about it? How are they constructing these various narratives And I think that once you understand those, you can unpack them. So it's very, very important to have an opportunity to do that. And I hope and encourage you all to do that. So let's go in and let's take a quick read at this. I think it's very good. So Iran, Venezuela, and the end of the Powell Doctrine. When bombs began falling on Iran this weekend, most Americans were as surprised as the rest of the world. The U.S. force posture in the Middle East had been building in the preceding weeks, but negotiations between Washington and Tehran were still underway. Even as the U.S. military readied for an attack, the Trump administration obscured the exact objective. There was remarkably little national debate, scant discussion with U.S. allies, and no vote in Congress about the desirability of conflict. 2 days into the war, administration officials have yet to articulate a specific vision for how it will end. Instead of employing decisive force, U.S. President Donald Trump is prioritizing flexibility. This stance reflects a new way of war, visible across multiple Trump interventions from the Red Sea to Venezuela, that inverts traditional thinking on the use of force. Indeed, in many ways, Trump's use of force is the anti-Powell Doctrine. Developed during the Gulf War, 1990 to 1991, by General Colin Powell, who later served as Secretary of State, the Powell Doctrine held that force should be employed only as a last resort, after all nonviolent means have been exhausted. If war is necessary, however, it should proceed in pursuit of a clear objective, with a clear exit strategy and with public support. It should employ overwhelming, decisive force to defeat the enemy using every resource, military, economic, political, social, available. Derived from the lessons of Vietnam, of which, by the way, Colin Powell was a Vietnam veteran, the approach was designed to avoid protracted conflicts, high death tolls, financial losses, and domestic divisions. As Powell later wrote, military leaders could not quietly acquiesce in half-hearted warfare for half-baked reasons that the American people could not understand or support. So clearly you're seeing now some differences and separations that are emerging between the Powell Doctrine that came before President Trump and now this developing, we could call it a Trump Doctrine. Powell's approach, which built on criteria established by Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger in the 1980s, spurred debate from the start. Some critics thought the all-or-nothing approach to war would preclude the tailored use of force to achieve modest but still important goals. For supporters of the doctrine, that was precisely the point, and they saw continued interventions, such as those undertaken by the Clinton administration in Somalia, Haiti, and the former Yugoslavia, as a misuse of military power that risked failure or quagmire. The U.S. invasions of Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003 were key tests of the approach. The George W. Bush administration sought to apply the Powell Doctrine in both cases. It declared war only after the Taliban and Iraqi leaders, respectively, ignored U.S. demands and after the president spent considerable political capital to persuade Americans that the decisions to go to war were wise. The administration's stated objectives were clear: to eliminate the safe haven the Afghan government was providing al-Qaeda, and to rid Iraq of weapons of mass destruction, respectively. Now, we all know in this stream, we all know, for everybody who's watching, that's absolute bullshit. So the weapons of mass destruction was completely fabricated. The author still believes that this was somehow a justification. But as we know, we knew then, by the way, and we know now conclusively, there were no weapons of mass destruction at that time. The weapons of mass destruction that were given to Iraq were provided to Iraq by the Western powers during the war against Iran in 1980 to 1988. And they were used on the battlefield, of which people like Professor Morandi were subject to not one, but multiple chemical attacks. So everybody should understand that. And that's why when you're reading this stuff, you're thinking in your mind, okay, I understand where the author is coming from. I understand their biases. I understand their point of views, and I can critically dissect what I think is absolute horseshit. And of course, that was no objective that was clear. It was a false objective, and that should have been rules and grounds for not doing it. But of course, they manufactured consent for it. Continuing on, it also sought and received congressional authorization in both cases. That's true. In Afghanistan, U.S. forces combined a lean on the ground presence with withering air attacks and support for fighters in the Northern Alliance, which entered Kabul and overthrew the Taliban. In Iraq, 160,000 US troops launched a ground invasion to topple the regime. In both instances, the planned exit strategy was to turn governing institutions over to exiles, local leaders, and domestic security forces, after which American troops would come home. Now, if we pause here, how did that go for the Western alliance? Clearly, it did. The US was thinking to itself, we can turn over governing institutions to exiles, local leaders, and domestic security forces, while at the same time in Iraq, carrying out de-Baathification, completely creating a sectarian environment that didn't allow for the unity of the country. And in Afghanistan, they started a process of nation building, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, but in Afghanistan even more. They started a process of nation building that was absolutely creating a dual power and a dual structure of society. So Kabul started to look more Western, but the rest of the country, especially the provincial areas and the more rural areas, did not see any of that major impact. In fact, over time, the US military lost further and further control of the periphery. In a classic sort of guerrilla tactic, the Taliban started to take territory slowly from the periphery and started to conduct, you could even say, a Maoist type form of guerrilla warfare to take first the countryside. And after the countryside was taken slowly, it started to make major advances into the cities and the urban areas. And you saw very rapidly that the whole country fell as a result. So this is also an extremely, I would say it's overall, it's a piss poor strategy, but it's absolutely evil strategy to somehow take over a country and remake it in your image when the people do not support you in any way and the people have no say in this. So that's very important to recognize here. So continuing on, things clearly did not go according to plan in either case. We know, we lived through it. Attempting to avoid prolonged conflicts brought them about anyway. The wars proved extraordinarily costly and deeply divisive, and their objectives seemed only to shift over time. Whether the intervention's problems came from a misapplication of the Powell Doctrine or from the misconception of the approach itself, the dark shadows of Afghanistan and Iraq have colored every U.S. military intervention of the past 2 decades, including the war now underway in Iran. In an effort to avoid repeating such debacles, the Trump administration has pursued something like their inverse. And while the Trump doctrine comes with serious challenges, it has also produced unexpected results, and it is likely here to stay. So clearly, the Trump administration wants greater latitude. It wants to have more flexibility on all warfighting and on all objectives. And that provides it the opportunity to not take a position and then be held accountable for that position, but to kind of waffle and go back and forth, up and down, and play this kind of 4, 5, 6D chess and try to constantly move the goalposts with the media and with the American public about what the objectives are, what's being accomplished, what needs to be committed, how much of the cost has to be borne by the American people and by overall the military that's now undertaking this effort that has been launched. So this new approach to war began forming in Trump's first term and has solidified in his second. In 2017 and 2018, Trump ordered missile strikes against Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria and continued U.S. military operations in Iraq and Syria against the Islamic State, also known as ISIS, including the raid that killed ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. In 2020, U.S. forces killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. Last year, Trump launched a war against the Houthis in Yemen, destroyed key Iranian nuclear sites, and attacked militants in northern Nigeria. This year, his administration invaded Venezuela to seize its president, Nicolas Maduro, and just 2 days ago launched a major operation in Iran. By the way, I was in Yemen, in Sana'a, in the capital, as the U.S. was bombing it. We went to bomb sites. There was a bomb. I was with Jackson and our crew. There was a bomb that exploded just streets away, and it shook everything. And it was, you could hear the whizzing as it came down and the impact. We went to impact sites. We saw them destroy a cancer hospital so much. We went there. You could still smell the bomb. You could still smell the kind of chemical cocktail from the propellant and the explosives that were used. It was horrible. It was horrible to see. And we were able to identify pieces and fragments of the bomb, and they were clearly U.S. made. So that's something that is very, very much part of this story, that we're living it right now. We're living this current transformation in military doctrine. And some of us, especially in our community, have experienced it firsthand. Those operations' departures from more traditional ways of employing force are striking. The Powell Doctrine, for its part, holds that war should be a last resort, turned to only after political, diplomatic, and economic means have failed to attain the desired objective. In 1990, President George H.W. Bush gave Saddam Hussein a deadline for withdrawing his forces from Kuwait, and a decade later, President George W. Bush gave both Saddam and the Taliban public ultimatums before beginning hostilities. That's nothing new, because Trump also gave a public ultimatum. He said, basically, don't do nuclear anymore. Give up your missiles. Give up support of the proxies, and we won't conduct military action. Right. So those ultimatums always exist, more or less. But now, even within negotiations, they're launching attacks. So it's not even that they're waiting for the ultimatum to take hold. They're just launching attacks, and there you go. Take it. Trump's approach, on the other hand, has been to use ambiguity as a source of advantage to catch his opponents off guard. The 2025 and 2026 U.S. attacks on Iran, for instance, took place as negotiations were ongoing. His administration issued no public ultimatums to Soleimani or Maduro. For Trump, it seems, force is not something to employ only when all other means have been exhausted, but rather one of several tools available to increase leverage, maximize surprise, and produce outcomes. Now, of course, you all will know that these outcomes are short-term. They're not necessarily long-term outcomes. These are short-term outcomes that don't necessarily provide long-term benefits. They do provide short-term chaos, which is, I think, beneficial for some people and some groups, but it does not provide for long-term stability, prosperity, and peace in any of the regions where they are conducting this. And you've seen that this force has been utilized to basically take state hostage. So we have, for example, President Maduro and his wife Celia in prison in New York, and simultaneously we have basically the Venezuelan government hostage to whatever the US government wants. The Venezuelans have not really reacted in a public way against the US by actually trying to push it out. They've acquiesced to a lot of the demands of the US, even though some have been vocal. There's nothing more that they're willing to do at this point, at least at the governmental level. Another element of the Powell Doctrine that Trump seems to have done away with is the emphasis on public support. And that's what we're talking about here, right? The Powell Doctrine treats the Vietnam-era protests against American intervention as the paradigmatic case to be avoided. If some objective is important enough for Americans to fight for, the thinking went, then the people in whose name the fighting takes place had better support it. Establishing such support generally requires the president to make a case frequently and over the course of months. Congress is expected to demonstrate its own approval through a vote to authorize force after extended debate. So we know, many of us know, the Vietnam protests were an axial moment in American history. They transformed the political scene. They transformed the war itself. It led to the end of the war. And it changed, I think, a lot of the cultural history from then on. That's where we get movies like Rambo and sort of the disgruntled soldiers that aren't respected by American society anymore, and that have been betrayed by their own government. Right? That's a key thing. They not only have lost the support of the American people. The American people are free to choose. They were betrayed by their own government. That's the even bigger part. So that's something to consider at this point. So that's something very interesting for us to understand, that public support no longer factors in. The Iraq War demonstrations, of which I participated in, the anti-Iraq War demonstrations, there were millions of people on the streets. New York, London, Chicago, Seattle, LA, all over the world. South Africa, you name it, everywhere. There were public demonstrations against the war, the buildup to the war in Iraq. That didn't affect the war. There have been demonstrations ever since in every other intervention, and nothing has been able to stop these wars. In fact, the opposite. They've gotten more violent, more unpredictable, and more unknown as to when they would start, just like this recent war that was launched 9 days ago. So that's a big problem. And I think this is going to eat into a lot of the American, not only support, but trust in governmental institutions. We already have an erosion of trust in governmental institutions. We have an erosion of trust because of the endless wars, the regime change operations that have gone on, COVID-19, the pandemic, there's been a major erosion of trust. And now we have an erosion of trust that has taken place because of this belligerent foreign policy. And I think that that's really important to hone in on, because I think that's going to have lasting impacts in American political life. But not a single conflict during Trump's presidencies has been preceded by a campaign to win public support, and Congress has not voted to authorize any of them. Instead, each conflict began suddenly and followed an unpredictable course. Rather than lay out a case for each war, the president often insisted he hoped to avoid it. His administration put a priority on surprise, attesting, for example, that the Caribbean military buildup was to stop drug boats, not to prepare for a direct regime change operation in Venezuela. Congress was largely sidelined. Iran today presents an even more ambitious regime change operation, but in last week's nearly 2-hour State of the Union address, Trump talked about it in only a few sentences. The scale and stakes of the war make the administration's seeming disregard for public debate all the more remarkable. And I think that that's why you have major outcry by Massey, by, as dear brother Nathaniel says in the chat, by former veterans, by former military personnel like Brian McGuinness and many others who are going out there and saying, excuse me, what is this? We didn't sign up for this. This isn't our country. We don't recognize our country doing this. No more wars for Israel. America first. You said prioritizing America. Why are we going on this next adventure? And they are very angry about it. We have Massey upset about it. Tucker Carlson, Candace is speaking out against it. Of course, in politics, we have many on both aisles, although a minority on the Republican side, that are against this. And we even see former Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene basically coming out against this fully and saying she doesn't even recognize the administration at this point and their policies. So this is very serious. What we are seeing here is very, very serious. And I think that this erosion of public support, but also the erosion of including the Congress and pursuing sort of this this idea, which has been really a part of the Trump administration, but other presidencies as well. I would say Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump. These presidencies have really increased. And actually, you could go back to Dick Cheney and President Bush Jr., right? President George W. Bush. If you go back and you look at the idea of a more concentrated executive, a more powerful executive branch, they find their roots in some of the neocons, especially in Dick Cheney, who wanted to see this idea of an imperial presidency, of a presidency that could do military action without getting Congress's approval. And we'll come to that in a second. I'm going to talk about the laws of war and about the Constitution and the declaration of war. We'll get to the laws of war on a separate topic later on tonight. So this is very important for us to look at. The Trump administration has also avoided articulating clear objectives for its use of force. When announcing that war with Iran had begun, the president said that the objective was, and I quote, to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime, even though Tehran was neither enriching uranium nor in possession of missiles capable of reaching the United States. A day into the attacks, Trump wrote on social media that bombing was aimed at achieving, and I quote, our objective of peace throughout the Middle East and indeed the world. He has said both that the goal is regime change in Iran and that he is planning to negotiate with the leadership that replaces the supreme leader. Trump similarly said at first that pressure on Venezuela was necessary to stop drugs and gang members from entering the United States, before later explaining that the goal was to bring Maduro to justice, that he wished to take back oil stolen from the United States, and that the operation was consistent with the new corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. What precisely Americans are fighting for in each country and how they will know whether they attain that end remains unclear. Where the Powell Doctrine calls for clarity, Trump instead prizes flexibility. By claiming multiple and often vague objectives, the president retains the ability to stop the fighting without admitting defeat. This, rather than obvious victory, is his exit strategy. When announcing attacks on the Houthis, Trump said, "We will use overwhelming lethal force until we have achieved our objective," with the objective allegedly being to end Houthi attacks on American vessels in the Red Sea. The Houthis, Trump later said, would be completely annihilated. A month into an expensive and only partially successful bombing campaign, however, the administration cut a deal with the group to end its attacks. Finally, Powell's dictum holds that the United States should employ overwhelming, decisive force in pursuit of its objective, defeating the enemy as swiftly and soundly as possible. Trump's approach, on the other hand, favors short, sharp military actions that employ only particular kinds of force, especially air power and special forces, almost always excluding conventional ground forces. If the price of regime change in Iran is the large-scale deployment of ground forces, Trump has made clear that through past action that the United States will not pay it. It will instead settle for less. With the possible exception of its attacks on ISIS, the Trump administration's wars have largely employed limited rather than decisive force. In 2017, the United States launched strikes in Syria in response to Assad's use of chemical weapons against Syrian civilians. We know, of course, that that was fake, but they're saying here as if it was true. But Assad's leadership remained secure, and he used chemical weapons again in 2018, also false. In 2025, Trump boasted about obliterating Iran's nuclear sites, but in 2026, he cited the danger of Tehran acquiring a nuclear weapon as a casus belli, which is basically a cause for war. Maduro is now gone from Venezuela, but his regime remains in place. That is, PSUV, the Socialist Party of Venezuela, remains still in power under Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president under Maduro. In all of these cases, flexibility rather than decisiveness is the watchword, allowing Trump to settle for outcomes that were never clearly defined at the outset. And that is what I'm talking about in terms of moving the goalposts. Also, it's a bit like Trump is running war and American foreign policy as if it's social media. You move the goalposts, you switch the narrative, you can go back and forth, and there's actually nothing stable, nothing long-term, nothing impactful. It's all short-term, quick. There you go. I can make a meme. I can make a story. I can make a quick propaganda pick or clip or whatever. And that's what's necessary. That's what's to be achieved. And that sadly is not the best way to do foreign policy for any major country, especially a nuclear power. So now we're getting towards the conclusion. Good enough. In some ways, the Trump response to the Powell Doctrine has served recent history better than a dogmatic application of the original. Following the limited use of force against the Houthis with a bilateral agreement produced a better outcome than ignoring the attacks on U.S. shipping. It was also better than using pure military force, as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates had attempted for years. Likewise, the world is better off without Iran's nuclear sites at Fordo and Natanz, and without Soleimani running the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The jury remains out on Venezuela, but it is still possible that a democratic transition occurs and that the country avoids a descent into domestic chaos. Short, sharp uses of force that preserve flexibility in decision-making, leverage ambiguity and surprise, minimize the chances of quagmire, and end with a good enough outcome might be the best approach in many cases. So the author now is starting to see some positives in Trump's way of doing things versus the Powell Doctrine. They are likely not the best approach to all cases, however, and the limits of Trump's way of war may soon be clear. The attack on Iran represents the most ambitious of Trump's foreign policy gambits to date. Forcing regime change in a country that is much larger and more populous than Iraq or Afghanistan through an operation with no ground component and no obvious domestic allies, and in the face of an entrenched security apparatus, will be extraordinarily difficult. The range of nightmare scenarios from an IRGC-led military dictatorship to a descent into domestic chaos is wider than the happy possibility of a democratic uprising. And that's true. We've seen nothing that in any way indicates that there's going to be a successful regime change at this point. In fact, the Council of Experts has picked already the new supreme leader, and they're moving ahead with consolidating the power and whatever vacuum, which really there hasn't been any, that was left after the martyrdom of Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei. Here, the president's flexibility and ambiguity might show the way forward. If the United States and Israel are unsuccessful in toppling the Islamic Republic of Iran, if U.S. forces take significant casualties, if the American public grows tired of the conflict, or if the alternative to continued regime change rule looks even worse, Trump could stop the fight. By claiming that the objective was, from the beginning, to simply weaken Iran and to ensure that it does not obtain a nuclear weapon, the president could and likely would declare victory. In so doing, the president would upend one last Powell maxim, the Pottery Barn rule. Before the invasion of Iraq, the general cautioned, you break it, you own it. In an effort to break the Iranian regime, Trump has already telegraphed that the United States will not own the aftermath. Should it collapse, the Iranian people will need to pick up the pieces. If it endures, Washington will wrap up the fight and move on to other priorities. Such a scenario would demonstrate one more limitation of the Trump approach. However, it does not pave the way for long-term peace, but postpones conflict to another day. So there we have this very interesting article, and I thought it provided a great opportunity to really get in the mind of some of the foreign policy establishment and what they're thinking at this point. And that's very important for us to recognize and to understand, to unpack. So this was a great way to kind of look at the Powell doctrine and then its antithesis in the developing, we can say, Trump doctrine. Let's change gears now and let's look at what the Russian foreign policy establishment is saying, because I think this is also very, very important to look at and to unpack. So let's take a look here. Let's take a look and put this out here. Right. So here we go. So this is Russia in Global Affairs. This is the Foreign Affairs of Russia, basically the equivalent journal. And this is for Russian foreign policy experts to get it out there and to speak about what's happening in Russian affairs and in international affairs from a Russian perspective. So this is Fyodor Lukyanov, who's very famous, very well established. He's the editor-in-chief of this periodical of Russia and Global Affairs. He's also a professor at the Higher School of Economics and also at the Valdai Discussion Club. So his article is entitled, Iran is not Iraq. And that was just from a few days ago. He writes, shock and awe was the term used to describe the U.S. operation against Iraq in spring 2003. In hindsight, it marked a turning point. The rapid defeat of the Ba'athist regime and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein created the impression that the U.S. had acquired the ability to reshape entire regions at will. Reality turned out differently. The war did not bring change, but not the kind the war did bring change, but not the kind its architects envisaged. The old order in the Middle East collapsed, replaced not by stability, but by a chain of crises that demanded enormous resources to contain with limited success. The blow to America's global reputation proved lasting. At the end of winter 2025, I think they mean to say, or 2026 is actually the correct, sorry. At the end of winter 2026, the US and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran. In a sense, Iran's emergence as the principal adversary of both countries is a direct consequence of the Iraq campaign 2 decades earlier. Whether today's attackers can achieve quick and decisive results remains unclear. Iran is the most serious opponent the US has confronted directly in many decades, and that's a fact. Even if military success is swift, the balance of forces is not in Iran's favor, and even if the post-war chaos of Iraq is avoided by steering clear of international occupation, the broader consequences are likely to disappoint. US President Donald Trump and the ideologue shaping his Middle East policy, many of whom are also relatives and business partners, have their own calculations. Israeli military superiority, combined with deepening commercial ties between Israel and the Gulf monarchies, would allow the US to channel economic benefits primarily to itself. Major geo-economic and logistical projects of interest to China, Russia, and India would become dependent on American oversight. Washington would expand its control over key markets, particularly raw materials and military technical cooperation. At the same time, the supposed ineffectiveness of groupings created without US participation, above all BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, would be put on display. And by the way, we're seeing that this is also a war against Russia, China, against BRICS, against the developing multipolar world. That has to be emphasized at this point. The Iraq War also began with slogans of regional restructuring in the name of security, laced with unmistakable mercantile interests. One need only recall Dick Cheney and Halliburton. Yet the central justification was ideological, the export of democracy, right? State building, democratic reforms, democratic transition, democratic states emerging in the region. Trump and his circle have relegated ideology to the background, emphasizing material returns instead. The earlier approach failed not merely because democratic transformation proved illusory, but because prolonged instability made it impossible to extract the desired dividends. The new openly transactional model may appear more pragmatic, but it carries its own risks. External coercion framed purely in commercial terms can provoke powerful ideological backlash, awakening forces united precisely by their rejection of imposed order. If successful, the White House may conclude that it has history and even God on its side, encouraging greater assertiveness at home and abroad. If not, escalation may still follow as aggression becomes a substitute for results. Either way, the Middle East is entering another phase of turbulence with consequences that will radiate far beyond the region, and that, for all involved, promises nothing good. So that's really important here. This is really important. Now you get the Russian perspective. And I think the Russian perspective is clearly in the camp that this does not promote peace and security. It will not be effective. It is also targeting what is already developing on its own accord, which is the multipolar world, BRICS, but also that BRICS and the SCO are unable to push back against this. So it also is a more realist position. It's not copium. It's also showing that the reality is the Russians and the Chinese are not prepared to intervene militarily or in any forceful way to stop this, and that BRICS and the SCO are organizations without teeth, without the ability to stop, this new crusade launched by the West and their proxies. That's very important to recognize as well. So we have to be sober in our analyses. I think that that's very clear and very important. Only when we are sober can we really understand the issues at hand and really take into account what needs to be done to make the world more peaceful and to expand the diplomacy, the cooperation necessary for that. So let's take a look now. There was another article by him, but I want to get to an important. Actually, you know what? We will read this one because I think it's important. I think it's important to listen to this because of how we know, first and foremost, that Ukraine has made an attempt, multiple attempts, but an active attempt on the life of President Putin. So this killing, this targeted assassination of a head of state is a real serious escalation, and I think that needs to be analyzed. So here, let's read Lukyanov's article, which is The Killing of a Head of State and the End of Old Restraints. So he writes, Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei is dead, and the international system is entering a far more dangerous phase than many appear willing to acknowledge. One may hold any opinion about the Islamic Republic of Iran, about its ideology or ruling elite. There are ample grounds for criticism, some severe. Yet one basic fact remains. Ali Khamenei was the legitimate head of a UN member state recognized by virtually the entire international community and a lawful participant in international relations. This included ongoing political negotiations with those who ultimately organized the attack, negotiations that continued until the moment the hostilities began. Even when compared with the brutal ends of Muammar Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein, the difference is stark. Gaddafi was killed by Libyan opponents amid internal collapse. Hussein was executed following a trial conducted by an Iraqi court. however flawed one may judge it. Iran's case is different. It resembles the method Israel has used against the leadership of Hezbollah and Hamas: direct elimination by external force without intermediaries, without legal framing, and without the pretense of internal process. What is being dismantled here are the remaining restraining mechanisms of international relations inherited from earlier eras. Because this erosion has been gradual, many political elites treat these events as sharp but understandable manifestations of geopolitical rivalry. They are mistaken. Opponents of the US are entitled to draw two clear conclusions. First, negotiating with Washington is pointless. The only viable options are capitulation or preparation for a force-based resolution. Second, there is no longer any safe retreat and nothing meaningful left to lose. In these circumstances, any remaining instruments, be they literal or figurative, become legitimate. These conclusions will hold regardless of how events in Iran unfold in the coming days. Resistance to this model will now harden, not soften. It will become more determined, more desperate, and potentially more destructive. In this context, there is little point in invoking international law, even as irony. So I think that this is very, very, very important. I want to focus on this because this is a person who is in the Valdai Club, who is a senior intellectual in Russia, who is the editor-in-chief of Russia's main foreign policy magazine that is connected with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, saying what? Saying that negotiating with Washington is pointless. And why do I think that's important? Because we were technically still within the negotiating process about Ukraine. So I think that a lot of people in Russia are thinking, okay, the US is going to do what they want to do regardless. What's the point of having these negotiations? Let's just finish the special military operation as we should. Let's just continue with the special military operation without ceasing. And I think that that's very important. And that's very critical to some of the foreign policy establishment here that don't trust the US. Of course, the liberals will try to find excuses, and those who want to have good relations with the US will try to find excuses and try to explain it away. But the fact of the matter is, it cannot be explained away. It is very much a reality that the US has destroyed itself as an arbiter, as some sort of partner in international diplomacy, in negotiations, in peace. So that's why I agree. Somebody in the comment section is talking about the Witkoff-Dmitriev. I agree. This theater, of course, is seen in different ways here. I won't go through all the details, but some of them see this as theater also from Moscow's side to continue with the special military operation with the looks that diplomacy is going underway and that Russia is, trying to act in good faith. But I think the Russians are not, they don't have rose-colored glasses. They understand full well that the United States is also a power that's following a realist political line, and one that is looking at the international system as anarchic, not as having rules, not as having structures and borders and spheres of influence, but absolutely imposing itself wherever it wants, like an elephant in a china closet. And I think that that's very important. The realist here that I would say, the realist is that the US is pursuing its own objectives and aims without necessarily ideological considerations at heart anymore. That's not to say that the ideological considerations of liberal humanitarian interventionism and democracy promotion and human rights constrain the US, but that the US is acting with a much more raw sense of power and realism in this case. So that's what I think. And it's pursuing its objectives regardless of the consequences for potential allies and for others that might be affected in the regions where it's operating. So that's an important key here that I would say. Let's turn gears now. I'd like to turn gears to another interesting topic. And this is, so we have two more topics for tonight. This topic is very important and near to my heart. We're going to talk now about the act of declaring war and the war powers, because I think that's important. And I think that we should break it down and take a look at what exactly we're talking about when we speak about the war powers in the US context. So let's first read this article, also from Russia and Global Affairs, called L'État c'est lui. And this is from Dylan Payne Royce, who's now a research fellow in Russia, but was educated in the US. So we have here the article talking about war. He writes, due to a misunderstanding of the US legal system, under which the Constitution is supreme, right? It's the supreme law of the land, and a misreading of certain laws, some confusion has arisen within the Russian expert community regarding the legality under US law of Trump's attack on Iran. I would like to take the opportunity to clarify that the attack is manifestly illegal. The US Constitution, which in theory still matters and indeed takes precedent over all other law in the US, provides Congress with the authority to declare war. It does not provide the president with similar authority. Accordingly, the US may conduct hostilities or at least initiate war against another state only with congressional authorization. Obviously, going to war with another state without actually declaring war does not allow the president to avert this clause. It merely means that the action is now not only unconstitutional, but also a violation of international custom norms. One of several such violations given, he means Khamenei's assassination, a violation of the norm against targeting leaders, the murder of Iranian schoolgirls and other civilians, who amongst Iranian casualties so far appear to outnumber legitimate military targets, incidentally, in the same way that civilians have been the vast majority of Israeli victims in Gaza. Note the specification above: 1, initiation; 2, of war; 3, against another state. That is definitely the authority of Congress. Gray areas do exist around 1, waging a war that has been started by an adversary; 2, deploying forces into a context and or for purposes that may develop into combat; and 3, using force against non-state actors. The War Powers Resolution was intended to address these and perhaps other gray areas. It constrained the president's authority within such situations and certainly did not expand his authority beyond such contexts. In particular, the War Power Resolution requires that if the president deploys forces for combat or potential combat in a manner that is permissible under the Constitution, example, in response to attack or for combat adjacent purposes, for example, advisors to South Vietnam or forces in Saudi Arabia to deter a continued Iraqi offensive in 1990, or against a non-state actor like Al-Qaeda, then the president must receive authorization from Congress within 90 days. Again, this is not an expansion of the president's authority, but a narrowing of it. It was intended to prevent a repeat of the U.S.'s slide into the Vietnam War. It does nothing and could do nothing, given constitutional supremacy, to alter Congress's exclusive authority to initiate war against other states. The resolution explicitly states this in its 3rd paragraph. The constitutional powers of the president to introduce U.S. forces into hostilities or into situations where hostilities are likely are exercised only pursuant to 1, a declaration of war; 2, specific statutory authorization; or 3, attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. He has none of these things. The attacks, therefore, are unconstitutional and illegal under U.S. law. If the rule of law still existed within the U.S. military would have refused to obey the orders, given that they are illegal and thus invalid, and the president would be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. Actually, he really should have been impeached during his first term for the almost as clearly illegal airstrikes against Syria. Unfortunately, such strikes were one of Trump's few actions that Democrats actually supported. Democrats were, if anything, mostly concerned that Trump was not hawkish enough in his first term, inventing the Russiagate hoax and impeaching Trump for the high crime of not supporting Kiev with sufficient enthusiasm. And indeed, Obama also violated the Constitution with his attacks on Libya, although they, like Trump's airstrikes on Syria, were not quite as blatantly illegal as Trump's attack on Iran and Venezuela, since Libya and Syria were riven by civil wars and thus conceivably their governments could be viewed as illegitimate. So these new attacks are probably best seen less as specifically Trumpian or Republican failure and more as a manifestation of the US's general slide from the rule of law into Caesarism, not the fun kind. So this is a great perspective from a scholar in Russia, US-trained scholar in Russia, who's speaking about this. Now, what I want to do is I want to go in for you all so you can look and analyze this on your own if you have time at some point. I want you to be able to use these resources and to learn how to do that. So let's go here to read the Constitution and some thoughts. So for those who don't know, I studied law at Cornell Law School, and this is the Cornell Law School Legal Information Institute. It's one of the best resources if you're interested in the law. I don't know if we have any lawyers in the chat. Those of you who have studied the law, either as a JD, as an LLM, as an MSLS, as a master's in law, as a bachelor's in law, whether it be an LLB or something, all of you understand that the law is very important and critical to understanding the structure of power, the division of power, and how that power is used. Now, here we have the U.S. Constitution annotated, and I'll show you how to look at it. So we already know, everybody here knows that the war powers are vested in the legislator. So we're looking at Article 1 of the Constitution. So the Constitution has how many? It has 7 articles, and then it has amendments. So we're looking at the articles, not the amendments. The first 10 amendments of the Constitution are called what? Do we have anybody in the chat who knows what the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution are called? They have a special name for those who know. I'm curious if we have anybody in the chat who can throw it up there. There we go, the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights. And that was a very important part of the big constitutional debate that took place after the Articles of Confederation began to unravel. And you had the big debates between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and the big constitutional debate between the states. And eventually you have the Bill of Rights that are added to the Constitution. But you have the first 7 articles. So let's go to Article 1, the legislative branch. And let's go to, we are looking for here, hold on. We are looking for war powers. So let's look here. Oh, actually, I want to go here. It doesn't, actually, there's a mistake here. So I'm going to have to, hold on. Let me go back here. Put 1 here. There we go. War powers, Clause 11. To declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water, right? So the legislator is the sole power in the United States that can declare war, at least according to our legal architecture, according to our structure of government. Of course, many of us know that a lot of this doesn't really hold weight and nobody's held accountable, but at least I want to show you what on paper it looks like. By the way, somebody's saying that I would make a great teacher. I've been a teacher for 8 years. I was a professor, a lecturer, and a high school history teacher. So this is what I do. This is, I've taught US history, world history, all of that stuff. So I'm already there with you all. So let's keep going here. So now what we want to do, let's look at the source of war powers, because I think that's interesting for us to understand why is the legislator the one that has the war powers and not the president, for example. So we click here, source of war powers, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, source of war powers. The Congress shall have power to declare war, like we said. Now here's the notes on this. 3 different views regarding the source of war powers were expressed in the early years of the Constitution and continued to vie for supremacy for nearly a century and a half. In The Federalist, Alexander Hamilton elaborated on the theory that the war power is an aggregate of the particular powers granted to a national government. In 1795, the argument was advanced that the national government's war power is an attribute of sovereignty and hence not dependent upon the affirmative grants of the written Constitution. In McCulloch v. Maryland, Chief Justice Marshall appears to have taken a still different view, namely that the power to wage war is implied from the power to declare it. During the Civil War era, the two latter theories emerged from the Supreme Court. Speaking for 4 justices in Ex parte Milligan, Chief Justice Chase described the power to declare war as necessarily extending to all legislation essential to the prosecution of war with vigor and success, except such as interferes with the command of the forces and conduct of campaigns. In another case, adopting the terminology used by President Lincoln in his message to Congress on July 4, 1861, the court referred to the war power as a single unified power. In 1936, the court explained the logical basis for imputing such an inherent power to the federal government. In United States v. Curtis Wright Corps, Justice Sutherland stated the reasons for this conclusion. As a result of the separation from Great Britain by the colonies acting as a unit, the powers of external sovereignty passed from the crown not to the colonies severely, but to the colonies in their collective and corporate capacity as the United States of America. Even before the declaration, the colonies were a unit in foreign affairs, acting through a common agency, namely the Continental Congress, composed of delegates from the 13 colonies. That agency exercised the powers of war and peace, raised an army, created a navy, and finally adopted the Declaration of Independence. It results that the investment of the federal government with the powers of external sovereignty did not depend upon the affirmative grants of the Constitution. The powers to declare and wage war, to conclude peace, to make treaties, to maintain diplomatic relations with other sovereignties, if they had never been mentioned in the Constitution, would have vested in the federal government as necessary concomitants of nationality. That's brilliant legal speak. But this provides you with an opportunity to take a look at not only the War Powers Act, or the War Powers in the clause in the Constitution, and later on the various actions that take place and different legal bills that are passed, including the War Powers Act, but also the origin of why we have this power vested in the legislator. And of course, at the end, we understand that because we divided from Great Britain, because we had a revolution, and that revolution was comprised not by one, but of all of the colonies together in unity, that power then is vested in the federal government and specifically in the legislator. And that is the source. That is the source of where sovereignty resides, because the people are sovereign. We do not have a monarchy in the US. We don't have, a hereditary monarchical rule like an aristocracy and landed aristocracy like in the United Kingdom, which we had a revolution against. But that sovereignty rested in the people. Therefore, the people's representative, the representatives of the people, have the power vested in them by the mere fact that they are representatives of the whole of the people. And so, in this republic way of thinking, that's why the legislator is enshrined with this right for declaring war. So that's very important for people to understand. Now we go to our final topic tonight, which I think is also very important for us, and that is looking at the following. So let's watch some videos here. I want to take this opportunity to look at what the U.S. has done to Iran, specifically in Tehran, by targeting civilian oil infrastructure, including oil storage sites, oil depots, and possibly a refinery. We're not quite 100% sure yet, but it looks as if that could also be the case. So let's take a look at this, and we will discuss it together. So you're seeing these apocalyptic sites of these fires raging after joint attacks were taking place in the capital to target this civilian infrastructure. Let's take a look at the next video together. those are the streets on fire. And those channels actually provide water for a lot of the trees and vegetation and are part of the much larger water / sewage system that exists in the city, which means that the oil spilled out and started to enter waterways and the sewers as well, which is an enormous environmental impact. And we cannot dismiss that. Let's take a look at the black rain in Tehran. I mean, that is quite a sight to see. That is quite a sight to see. It's very much apocalyptic if one is looking at it and not knowing what's going on. And let's take a look at how the CNN reporter on the ground reported on the situation.
This is what Tehran is waking up to this morning. The sky above the city is covered in very thick black clouds. You can see that everywhere. That's the west of the city over there, and this is the north of the city. Normally, if you look to that direction, you could actually see the Alborz Mountains, but now all of that is also covered in clouds. That comes after major airstrikes in the south and the west of the city happened last night, where oil installations were hit, oil storage facilities. Apparently also a refinery might have been hit as well. And now you can see this morning that the sky is still very dark. We saw thick black plumes of smoke in the sky yesterday. There were massive fires in the south of the city. But I want to show you something else, because it's also raining. But you can see that the rain water is actually black, also saturated, it appears, with oil. And then if we look over there, you can see that the water that's running down here also is black. So that's what's coming down this morning, this sort of oil-filled rain that we have right now on the Iranian capital after the strikes.
So we're seeing these sites in front of us, and we even have, for example, you can see here just that heavy smoke in the skies that has mixed with the clouds and produced this rainfall that has this, all these chemicals that are falling down on Iranian streets, houses, outdoor clothing that people are hanging up after doing the laundry, on pets, on trees, on vegetation, on pools, on reservoirs, you name it. Everything is covered on never mind the historic sites, the mosques, the churches, everything in the city that now is covered in this. So this is really horrific. This is really horrific. And now I want to break it down with you. I want to look at this and I want to think about it with you all. What does this mean in the context of the laws of war? Because I studied these and I want to help give you the tools to really understand, is what happened here? First of all, what happened here? How do we understand what happened here? And then, is this illegal? First and foremost, what happens when you burn fuel? So let's take a look. Let's take a look here at what happens when you burn fossil fuels. So the burning of fossil fuels, we know, releases carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. Okay, we know that. But also, we have this part here, which I think is very important for us. Sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and carbon dioxide react with water vapor, oxygen, and other chemicals to form acid rain. Acid rain can contaminate freshwater sources, resulting in harmful algal blooms that reduce water oxygen levels and harm fish populations and other wildlife. Additionally, acid rain increases chemical weathering of rocks, including man-made structures. This is from the University of Berkeley's program about understanding global change in terms of the environment. But what's interesting here, I want to look at some of the environmental impacts and some of the health impacts. We also have here from the American Lung Association, sulfur dioxide. What is sulfur dioxide? Sulfur dioxide is a gaseous air pollutant composed of sulfur and oxygen. SO2 forms when sulfur-containing fuel such as coal, petroleum oil, or diesel is burned. Sulfur dioxide gas can also change chemically into sulfate particles in the atmosphere, a major part of fine particle pollution, which can blow hundreds of miles away. So this won't be contained just to Tehran. This will extend, if the weather patterns hold true, it will go into Central Asia and possibly even into China. What are the health effects of sulfur dioxide pollution? Sulfur dioxide causes a range of harmful effects on the lungs, wheezing, shortness of breath, and chest tightness, and other problems, especially during exercise or physical activity. Rapid breathing during exercise helps SO2 reach the lower respiratory tract, as does breathing through the mouth. Long-term exposure at high levels increases respiratory symptoms and reduces the ability of the lungs to function. Short exposures to peak levels of SO2 in the air can make it difficult for people with asthma to breathe when they are active outdoors. Increased risk of hospital admissions or emergency room visits, especially among children, older adults, and people with asthma. And that's just here speaking about the impact on the lungs, never mind the other broader environmental impacts. So let's look at this article that came out, which I thought was very, very good. This is from Common Dreams, intentional chemical warfare, toxic black rain in Tehran after US-Israel bomb oil facilities. So the consequences of this environmental and humanitarian catastrophe will not be confined within Iran's borders. These strikes constitute war crimes, said a spokesperson for the Iranian Foreign Ministry. So the author, John, writes, in the wake of infernos unleashed across portions of Tehran the night before, the people of Iran's capital woke up Sunday to the hideous sight of ominous gray clouds above, choking levels of smoke, and black raindrops full of toxic oil falling across the city. Critics describe scenes of Armageddon and characterize the bombings and the destruction they triggered as the latest crimes committed by the US and Israel since they launched their unprovoked and illegal assault on the Middle East nation last week. Iranian officials urged residents to stay indoors to avoid the health impacts of the air quality following Israel's intentional bombing of several oil storage and processing facilities in the city on Saturday. On top of everything else, Israel and the US have unleashed an environmental disaster in Tehran, said Asal Rad, a fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. How many ways can they show you they have no regard for human life? And we see here X post from Trita Parsi, who's very important person in the Iranian diaspora, although he's Parsi origin. Iran's Red Crescent Society warned that the toxic rainfall in Tehran, home to approximately 10 million people, could be highly dangerous and acidic, and issued exposure guidelines for residents. Ismail Baki, a spokesperson for the Iranian Foreign Ministry, condemned the attacks and resulting damage in stark terms. The US-Israeli criminal war against the Iranian nation has entered a dangerous new phase, with deliberate strikes on Iran's energy infrastructure, said Baghai in an online statement. These attacks on fuel storage facilities amount to nothing less than intentional chemical warfare against the Iranian citizens. By targeting fuel depots, the aggressors are releasing hazardous materials and toxic substances into the air, poisoning civilians, devastating the environment, and endangering lives on a massive scale, he continued. The consequences of this environmental and humanitarian catastrophe will not be confined within Iran's borders. These strikes constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide all at once. In a Sunday morning video, CNN correspondent Frederick Plitgen showed the view from central Tehran, including the Blackwater gathering on every service. Plitgen also traveled to the Shahran oil depot among the facilities bombed Saturday, where dark gray smoke continued to billow into the air, and he described the amount of damage as immense. Though it is day, the sun cannot be seen in Tehran today because of all the smoke following the US and Israel bombing Tehran's oil refineries, said Trita Parsi, executive vice president for the Quincy Institute, a US-based foreign policy think tank. People on the ground describe it as Armageddon. Parsi, who is of Iranian descent, also took aim at members of the Iranian diaspora, who for weeks and months have pushed for the US and Israeli governments to attack their own country. History, he said, will not forgive Reza Pahlavi, Masih Alinejad, Nazanin Boniadi, and all other leaders who tricked Iranians into thinking this war would set them free. So that's a very important article to look at and to really take apart. Now, I want to look at the more interesting aspects of this all. Let's look at what this means in the broader sense of the of international humanitarian law. So let me ask the chat here: do we know of any other times where oil, I would say, refineries or oil assets were targeted in the past in a major war. Does anybody remember? Possibly maybe the images of oil fields on fire. Anyone remember a war where that's right, in Kuwait. Very good. So the Kuwait example, the Kuwait experience was a very important part of international law development. And it remains part of, yes, it was in the first Persian Gulf War. So it remains part of the experience and how people understood the environmental impacts. Also, it should be noted that some have claimed that Gulf War syndrome was a byproduct of that. So let's take a look at a very important paper. So this is from the, let me just make sure I have here okay, perfect. So let's go up to the top. So this is Gulf War Illness and the Health of Gulf Veterans, Scientific Findings and Recommendations from the Research Advisory Committee on Gulf War Veterans Illnesses. And this is posted on the U.S. Veterans Administration webpage, right? So va.gov. And let's go down. Let's go down here back to 75. And we'll take a look together. Okay, here we go. All right. So we have exposure to oil well fires and smoke during Gulf War deployment. There were about between 550 and 600,000 U.S. troops present in the Gulf theater. So oil fire pollutants of possible concern. The hundreds of burning oil wells presented a complex mix of potentially hazardous substances to those covered with oil or breathing the heavy black smoke. The composition of crude oil varies by region and strata, but burning crude typically produces a smoke composed of a mixture of particulates and gases that include carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, oxides of nitrogen, volatile organic compounds, ozone, various polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, acid aerosols, and soot. Extensive analysis of the Kuwaiti oil fire smoke found that the smoke contained the expected mixture of pollutants. In addition, hydrogen sulfide, a major component of natural gas, was present at varying concentrations. The most visible components of the mix were the particulate matter and carbonized particles, or soot, that formed the huge smoke plumes. The smoke contained other components, including small amounts of various heavy metals, such as nickel, vanadium, iron, aluminum, beryllium, cadmium, calcium, chromium, arsenic, silicon, zinc, and lead, all present in crude oil as impurities. Pollutants associated with combustion of crude oil have been the subject of extensive toxicological testing as part of established U.S. and international environment and occupational safety programs. For some, but not all pollutants, standards have been established that are intended to represent exposure levels that can be experienced without increased risk of identified adverse effects. When inhaled or ingested at sufficient concentrations and durations, many of these compounds have the potential to cause known health effects, primarily acute and chronic respiratory conditions and cancers. However, little occupational or animal research has been done to evaluate the potential for oil fire pollutants to cause a constellation of chronic symptoms resembling Gulf War illness. Oil fire-related compounds have been associated with some categories of chronic symptoms that affect Gulf War veterans. Particulate exposures can cause the development of chronic respiratory symptoms, and VOCs, that's the volatile organic compounds, and heavy metals have the potential to cause neurological symptoms. Carbon monoxide is highly toxic, and exposure is associated with a variety of symptoms such as fatigue, headache, confusion, nausea, and impaired vision and coordination, some of which can persist for many years. So here you have the report from the government that speaks about the pollutants that were involved with the oil fires and what they did to people and what they released, what they had. And it's not only a few chemical compounds, there are also heavy metals involved. So this kind of pollution is significant for humans, for livestock, for other animals, and for agriculture, and generally for the environment. So now you'd ask yourself, what does international law say about this? And let's go and take a look. So this is the International Committee of the Red Cross International Humanitarian Law Database. Rule 45, causing serious damage to the natural environment. The use of methods or means of warfare that are intended or may be expected to cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment is prohibited. Destruction of the natural environment may not be used as a weapon. And so here we are specifically looking at the various protocols that exist regarding the destruction of the environment. Now, there's a lot here, and I won't go through it all, but the basis comes down here. So, for example, we'll look here. In addition to the specific rules contained in the ENMOD Convention, significant practice exists prohibiting a deliberate attack on the environment as a method of warfare. The legislation of several states criminalizes ecocide. Estonia's penal code prohibits affecting the environment as a method of warfare. Yugoslavia condemned what it called ecocide in connection with the NATO attack on a petrochemical plant in 1999. Iraq, in a letter to the UN Secretary General in 1991, stated that it would not exploit the environment and natural resources as a weapon. Kuwait, in a letter to the UN according to the UN Secretary General in that same year, stated the environment and natural resources must not be used as a weapon of terrorism. During a debate in the 6th Committee of the UN General Assembly in 1991, Sweden, referring to the destruction of the environment by Iraqi forces, said that this was an unacceptable form of warfare in the future. In the same context, Canada stated that the environment as such should not form the object of direct attack. Also noteworthy is the declaration adopted in 1991 by the OECD Ministers of the Environment, condemning Iraq's burning of oil fields and discharging of oil into the Gulf as a violation of international law, and urging Iraq to cease resorting to environmental destruction as a weapon. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to take us to the Geneva Conventions, to the protocols, and to take a look at what it actually says regarding the environment. So let's go here. So first we'll go up. So this is from the protocol additional to the Geneva Conventions of 12th August 1949 and relating to the protection of victims of international armed conflicts. This is Protocol 1 of 8 June 1977. So let's go down, and where did I find it here? I believe it was Article 55. So let's go to Article 55. Let's keep going. Here we are. All right. Article 55 says, Article 55, protection of the natural environment. 1. Care shall be taken in warfare to protect the natural environment against widespread, long-term, and severe damage. This protection includes a prohibition of the use of methods or means of warfare which are intended or may be expected to cause such damage to the natural environment and thereby to prejudice the health or survival of the population. 2. Attacks against the natural environment by way of reprisals are prohibited. Prohibited. So you see it there in plain black and white. I am not making this up. This is the law. And I know many of you are saying in the chat that they don't care about the law. I know they don't care about the law, but I want you to know the law at least, so you have an understanding of what actually exists. This is another way to hold them accountable at some point, if we can ever hold them accountable. But it's a form of accountability. So, and I haven't even gotten to the UNESCO sites or all of the other war crimes that have been committed. I'm specifically talking about this because it was today, and it's something really, really serious. If we were to go with the girls, the school girls who were massacred by the U.S., if we were to talk about the UNESCO sites, there's a long list of war crimes now that have transpired. And the last screen I want to share is this article, which is from a law review article from the Vanderbilt Journal of Transnational Law. This is by Rex J. Zidalis, Burning the Kuwaiti Oil Fields and the Laws of War from 1991. And at the end, he talks about, so here, conclusion. The rules set forth in Protocol 1 of 1977 have yet to be acknowledged universally as part of the customary law of armed conflict. Therefore, they do not yet constitute a binding obligation on a non-party like Iraq. Nevertheless, the protocol contains provisions affecting the kinds of activity in which Saddam Hussein's forces engaged in Kuwait. For instance, Article 52 of Protocol 1 prohibits attacks on objects that do not make an advantage contribution to military action or offer a definite military advantage. Article 54, alluded to earlier, follows this by prohibiting military action against objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, such as drinking water installations, even though the purpose of the action is to deny the value of the object to an enemy. While a caveat exists for objects used solely to sustain combatants of the opponent or objects directly supporting an opponent's military action, a proviso exists limiting operations against these targets whenever the result would be to affect the civilian population to the extent that it would be forced to move away from the area. Finally, Article 55 leaves no doubt about the sanctity accorded to natural environment. That provision outlaws all methods or means of warfare that are intended or may be anticipated to cause widespread, enduring damage to the environment. So there you have it. There you have it. There you have it. I provided you with the legal background, with the actual protocols, additions to the Geneva Convention, and with a legal review paper that speaks about what happened, what transpired in Tehran is nothing short of a war crime. It is a violation of international law and, of course, the laws of armed conflict. And therefore, at some point, I hope that the United States can be prosecuted and Israel can be prosecuted for these crimes committed against the Iranian people. And sadly, and regrettably, and you know, I can't express my full feelings on this. It will have a long-term impact on the Iranian population in Tehran and in surrounding regions, who will suffer the consequences of this attack that really weaponized these oil depots as chemical weapons, no doubt about it. So finally, we have a quick ad to get through, and then I'd like to take maybe a few questions, and we can stop here. So let's go to our ad from our sponsor, and we'll be back in a few minutes. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce a great opportunity today, and something that I want to really speak to you all about. Now, I, as a kid, was a big fan of nuclear energy. Was something that I always admired. It was something that, for me, was very much about the future. So I want to speak to you about something that's happening today in the United States. On January 5th, 2026, the U.S. Department of Energy announced $2.7 billion in contracts to restore domestic uranium enrichment capabilities. Now, that's huge. For me, that speaks about independence, sovereignty, and it speaks about the possibilities for the future. And this isn't just government spending. It's not the pork, the fat, all the things that we speak about in terms of domestic U.S. politics. It's a declaration of intent. America needs uranium, domestic uranium, and it needs it now. Here's the reality. The U.S. consumes over 50 million pounds of uranium annually, but produces less than 1 million pounds domestically. Now, that's a huge gap. And this means we're dependent on foreign supplies for 98% of our uranium. That's a critical vulnerability for national security, power generations, and advanced defense systems. And of course, it's a critical gap for those who speak about America first. With Russia controlling significant global enrichment capacity and Greenland now banning uranium mining, the White House has made it crystal clear America must develop its own supply chain. And that includes, of course, the supply chain for uranium. This is where Atomic Minerals comes in. Trading on the TSX Venture under ATOM, ATOM, and OTC under ATMMF, this company isn't new to the game. It's a team with a history of delivering major uranium exits. The leadership includes members who were part of the discovery and subsequent $654 million sale of the Rough Rider deposit to Rio Tinto. The question is, can they do it again? Atomic controls 4 100% owned uranium projects strategically located in the Colorado Plateau, America's historic uranium province, which has produced over 597 million pounds of uranium. Trading at an 87% discount to the peer group average, the company presents potential upside as the market begins to recognize its strategic assets and proven management team. Now, Atomic's first flagship project is South Lisbon Valley East, located in the mining-friendly state of Utah. Many of you know Utah, of course, from the old westerns, but you should also know Utah as a very important geological natural resource. It has tremendous minerals. It has tremendous unexplored and vast potential in terms of those natural resources. This project in particular sits in the Lisbon Valley District, one of the most productive uranium belts in the entire United States. The district alone has produced 80 million pounds of uranium. That's documented history and proof that the geology works. Now, on January 14th, the U.S. administration showed their support again. The White House invoked Section 232 via an executive order, a formal declaration of U.S. resource independence. This goes beyond support. It's a mandate. Energy security is now synonymous with national security, and the U.S. government is deploying its full fiscal and regulatory arsenal to secure the nuclear fuel cycle within North America. Now, Atomic Minerals, trading as ATMMF in the US and Atom in Canada, is strategically positioned to capitalize on this shift. Uranium prices have surged, and some analysts project prices could exceed $100 per pound by 2026 as demand outpaces supply. Supported by renewed government focus on domestic uranium, the exploration sector is entering one of its most active drilling seasons in years. With its flagship drill program approved, Atomic Minerals has exploration underway and is advancing with a focus on execution and delivering results. I'll leave you with this. Members of the leadership team were behind the discovery and $654 million sale to Rio Tinto, an exit about 59 times larger than Atomic Minerals' current valuation. You do the math. If you want to learn more about this critical mineral story, about the importance of uranium, and the team that already delivered big results, check out the link in the description. A special thanks to Atomic Minerals for making today's video possible. All right, so we have time. We have a few minutes for any questions. I was trying to look back in the chat, and I just wanted to make sure if you have any questions, please drop them here. I can answer any questions you have very briefly. I thank you all for being with me again. It's a real pleasure to finally be streaming with you all and to really be doing what I love most, which is teaching. Teaching is my passion. I really love I miss my students in the class, and I really love to teach and to learn. I'm a lifelong learner. For those who don't know, I have multiple degrees, and I don't want to stop my education. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. And if not, we can save them for another day. No problem. So we have our first one here. Do you think this act of ecocide done by the Zionist U.S. empire was a desperate move? I think so. I think targeting a facility like this is a last resort. It shows that all of their military objectives have failed. Now they're resorting to the destruction of civilian infrastructure, and that's meant to put tremendous toll and pressure on the Iranian people, so that somehow the Iranian people will not only feel the sting of sanctions before, not only feel the pain of a war imposed on them, but also have oil falling from the sky and toxic chemical cocktail that can burn their skin with sulfuric acid, acid rain, and both sulfuric acid and nitric acid that can come from this, from the sky. And that's really horrible. And people are suffering as a result. And that's what they want. They want people to suffer so that they overthrow the government and then accept a regime imposed by the US. That's what they want. That's what they want. What are doing to our people? Oh, what they are doing to our people is pure evil. I agree, brother Nate. I agree. What they are doing is horrible, and I curse them all. It's the least I can do at this point. Is Pezeshkian cooked? I don't think he's cooked. I just think that with the election of Mojtaba Khamenei as the new supreme leader, I think that there's slowly going to be a consolidation of power, and Pezeshkian will have to get in line. But I don't think that he's necessarily cooked at this point. The Iranian water supply is a difficult situation. Of course, Iran doesn't rely for most of its water on desalination, and it also has access to a lot of fresh water and also a lot of water that's located in the mountains. But of course, in a city like Tehran, a lot of the reservoirs have now been impacted by this chemical attack, you can say, and that's a real concern for the water supply, Shelley. So that's a real concern for me, and it's a concern for many people who are wondering about how Iranians, 10 million plus in this city, are going to survive and going to thrive with this water quality degradation that can impact their health and overall all of their health metrics in the future. We have the next question here. Oh, sorry. Let me see. Why do Russia and China still act like international law matter bind them when the U.S. and Israel? Because their political class, their diplomatic corps are trained in this, and they very much uphold this, and they see themselves as responsible state actors. They don't see the U.S. or Israel as responsible state actors, but that doesn't mean that they're going to demean themselves in their position, because the rest of the world is also looking at them as well. And I think that they see themselves as leaders of the global South, and so they have to act in a certain way. I think that's part of the mechanisms and the rationale for why they do what they do. Also, it should be stated that Russia is not the Soviet Union, and China today is not the China of Mao, so they have different priorities and different understandings of how to act in the international system. Has the U.S. ratified anything on ecocide? I don't believe so. I think Trump has abrogated anything that would remotely be close to that, but I don't think there's anything at the federal level. I do know that there is stuff at the local level. Towns and municipalities have passed non-binding resolutions or town plans that include ecocide, but nothing at the federal level at this point. Iran recently told the resistance to be prepared to retake occupied Palestine. How do you see that playing out? I think it's very difficult to see that at this point. I would love that to be the case, but the Zionist entity is a nuclear power and will resort to nuclear weapons if it has to for its own survival. So I think that the best thing that can happen is to give them a defeat, not only on the battlefield, but in the court of public opinion and in the economic field. And I don't see a retaking of occupied Palestine done at this point in this way. I don't see that. Any new word on the supreme leader? Yes. So Mojtaba Khamenei is the son of the martyred Ayatollah Khamenei. He's a really profound scholar, and he spent a lot of his time at the seminary in Qom, studying philosophy and theology. He's more a hardliner. Many people have said he's much more strict in terms of how he wants to see Iran vis-a-vis relations with the West, and he's much more. I think he's not in the camp of Pezeshkian and those types, and he might even be a departure from his martyred father. I would say that the difference with his father is his father had, Ayatollah Khamenei had 10 years of military experience, and not only military experience, but also political experience. So he had experienced the 8 years war with Iraq, and also he held some other important offices in the Islamic Republic before becoming supreme leader. His son has not held any significant office. So that's a difference. That's a departure. Can they boil the water? Boiling the water won't impact. Boiling the water is for organic compounds. For example, viruses, bacteria, amoeba, things like that. But oil and chemicals do not get boiled out of water. You need to filter those out of water. So they need to go through a filtration system, ultimately. That's the key there. Question here, both sides will not back down. Both fight an existential war, especially that Israel is a maniac country having nuclear weapons. So where will this end? Will they Samson option at the end? They might. There's no doubt about that they have that in their pocket, that they have the Samson option if they want to resort to that. But I think that this could end in the U.S. declaring victory, Iran declaring victory, and actually basically just a cessation of forces unless before it escalates. If it escalates, I cannot tell you where this leads. It could lead to a third world war. I can't tell you. But if in the coming days, as some media are reporting that Trump wants to just declare victory and move away, It's possible. But I think the election of Mojtaba Khamenei is also a punch in the American and Zionist face, because they didn't believe that the Iranians would elect such a leader. So I think that might convince them to stay a little while. I'm going to try to stream every day. Yes, that's my goal. And shout out to ACP Florida. Thanks for all the love and for all the good work you do down there. And let's see, anything else? If nukes are the answer, why not go nuclear? They might go nuclear. I think that Mojtaba Khamenei might abrogate the fatwa of his father and basically say we need to build nuclear weapons for the stability and the safety and the continuity of Iran, for our sovereignty and for our future. It's an existential need. So they might end up building it. I'm not sure, but that might be the case. And lastly, leg is feeling better, slowly getting better. Today is my first really good day. I'm sorry, I have to adjust sometimes because, I have to constantly try to move it and make sure that it's not, painful in some positions, but it's getting better slowly. And thank you all for the love and the support. Thank you all for showing so much love to the channel. If you haven't already, please go over to my YouTube channel and subscribe, like, and share it with everybody. And thanks again, everyone. For all of the great work. 2 hours with you. I'd love it. I'd love to do it every day if we can. And please get the word out there. Hopefully it was productive and enjoyable and knowledgeable. That's my goal. My goal is for us to learn together and to continue to expand our minds, our horizons, and to build a better world together. So thank you again. Also, one last question here. Can you assess if China will open up a third front against the Zionists in Taiwan? I don't think so. I don't think at this point. I don't think China is prepared to do that at this point. At least I don't see any indication of that. And I just got back from China last week and spoke with some officials. So I don't see that. Thank you all again. Thank you so much. My blessings to you all. For those of you who are Iranian, again, we are together in this. My family's in Iran. Your families are in Iran and your loved ones. And to anyone who has friends who are there, we are together. We will struggle. We'll overcome this. And I believe Iran will be victorious in the end. Iran is a civilization far older than the US and the Zionist entity combined. It has endured much worse from the Mongols, from Hulagu Khan, and from many others who've tried to destroy it. It will endure forever. It, like Russia and China and many other civilization states, has that to its advantage. Thank you all again. Lots of love. And we'll see you all hopefully tomorrow for another great stream. I might have a special guest or be on somebody else's show that will stream together. So I'll let you all know. But again, lots of love and God bless you all and take care. Be well.